push the record button and then share. Okay, all right. Well, I think you're all here for Teaching Suprasegmentals by John Levis. He's going to tell us why we need to do that and how we're going to do it, right? So that'll be lots of fun. As people are marching into our room, I'd like to let you know that we are just so happy that you are joining us for one of the many TESL professional development events. So we in Teaching of Pronunciation Interest Group are pretty active. Maybe at this time you could mute yourselves and leave your dogs and coughing and airplanes to your side of the internet. Thank you. All right. So every month we have an event with the TESL Teaching of Pronunciation Interest Group. So we are so happy to have John Levis here to talk to us about teaching Suprasegmentals. But I want to first introduce my partners in crime, the Teaching of Pronunciation Interest Group coordinators. I am one of them, Jadine. Wave your hand, Jadine. Jadine is our other one. She is my co-coordinator. And later on, we will be visited by Randy Reitmeyer, who is our assistant coordinator. And just as you might know, those of us who hold many hats he's wearing another hat right now. So he's at a meeting, but he will join us soon. So we are the coordinators for this year. I see that we have a lot of TESL members here at our event, which is great because, as you know, it's a free event. Those of you who paid a few bucks to come here are here because you're non-members, but you might think of joining TESL because we are a very cool organization. And if you join us, you don't have to live in California. You could if you want to, but you don't have to. We have our peer-reviewed language publication called the TESL Journal. There's a new one out recently that you should take a look at. We also have our monthly announcements that tell you what great things are coming up. We have discounts and freebies to some events. You have free access to a very unlimited number of interest groups, like top levels, which means like if you are at K-12 or you're adult or you're a university and so forth, and chapters, which is a designation for region-based areas of the state of California. And of course, nowadays with remote everything, you got access to that whether you live or don't live in California. Got a lot of interaction, networking, and teaching opportunities with TESL. You have online discussions on our message boards with like-minded professionals. If you're looking for a job, you have access to the job bank, and we have other resources. We also have grants and awards for both teachers and students. So a lot of our master's students are receiving awards. So those are just some of the benefits of being a member of TESL. Now, what about today's presenter? Do you know something about why we have John from Iowa here? John and I met, we don't even know how long ago we met. We were thinking maybe back in the 1990s or so. Some of you are also members of TESL, right? We belong to SPLIS, which is this speech listening, speech pronunciation listening intersection. Did I get that right? And John was active in that in interception, and we know each other from that and from pronunciation and all of these other ways that we kind of mixed up. And so I was able to invite him to talk to us today. He is the Angela B. Pavitt Professor of English at Iowa State University, and he's been a member of TESL Prosig for over 25 years. Prosig is the pronunciation special interest group of TESL, which is kind of like the European equivalent of TESL, kind of, sort of, right? And he has authored so many articles and books and chapters that we cannot possibly name all of them. He's the author of Intelligibility, Oral Communication, and the Teaching of Pronunciation, which is a publication from Cambridge University Press. And he initiated the very, very cool and very specific pronunciation in second language learning and teaching conference back in 2009. And he's been the editor of most of those conference proceedings. So those are for pronunciation of second language, any kind of second language. It's very fascinating to go and listen about, you know, like if you're a teacher of English and you listen to what's happening in learning French pronunciation or learning Chinese pronunciation or all these other ways. It's really cool. He's also the founding editor of the Journal of Second Language Pronunciation. And you know, I don't know where he gets his time. He works with students who love him. And he's currently working on 2 books, Second Language Pronunciation, Bridging the Gap Between Research and Practice, and a classroom textbook called Pronunciation for a Purpose. Wow. Okay. Take a few breaths. And now I give you John Levis.
Okay, so let me share my screen here.
You do that.
I can find it. If you hear a phone ringing in the background, it's probably somebody wanting to sell me a warranty or something. So it will only ring 3 times and it will then disappear. But it does other things if I take it off the hook, just so you know. So I'm from Iowa State University, but my family actually lives mostly in California. And I did my high school, finished my high school and went to college, undergraduate in California, Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo. And I've been involved with TESL off and on for a number of years. So there are these kind of connections. I think mostly I go to TESL conferences when they end up in Northern California, and I can also visit family. So, but I'm thrilled to be here. Okay, let me make sure that I know where I'm clicking here. So what you're going to see today is based on a chapter that I wrote with Dorothy Chun, who's from UC Santa Barbara, on prosody and second language teaching. And this is from the Oxford Handbook of Second Language Prosody. And at the end of this, Marcia will show you where you can get this chapter. So it will have things that I didn't talk about, and it will have some things that I did talk about. And this was a really very interesting chapter to write, because most of the people who wrote in this handbook were people who do things that aren't very practical for most of us. And so when we were writing it, there was always this question of what do we do? What do we tell them that they don't know? Because they do research on this all the time. And then I started to realize that a lot of the tools that we use for second language teaching, for pronunciation and for suprasegmentals. Prosody is another word for suprasegmentals.
Yeah, I told you.
And I will change it to suprasegmentals, but if you just treat them as being the same term, that will make it easier for you to follow. So what we discovered was that a lot of the things that we do naturally as teachers are the things that the theorists really don't know anything about. And that's where this chapter came out of. So why are suprasegmentals or prosody important? Well, they have something to do with the intelligibility of speakers. And when we talk about intelligibility, we mean how accurately listeners understand a speaker. That might have to do with, do they identify the words that are being spoken? Okay? So if you hear a word like sentences, which I've messed the suprasegmentals up on, you probably have to think for a second, is if you understand it at all, what does this person mean by this? But if I give you sentences, then you process it very quickly. Comprehensibility, how much work listeners do in understanding a speaker. We've all spoken to people that we can understand, but we just work hard. And language learners run into this a lot, where they do understand what's being said to them often, but they have to work. They get tired doing this. And so in this sense, fluent speakers of a language may be less comprehensible to a language learner. And suprasegmentals also have to do with accentedness. So the extent to which an L2 accent is noticed. In all of these things, we know that suprasegmentals play a key role in how intelligible people are, how their messages are understood, how comprehensible they are, how much work people have to do to understand them, and these views of accentedness, or the extent to which they are noticed as being differently accented from the people around them in the community. One of the other reasons that suprasegmentals are important is that teaching suprasegmentals is more likely to lead to improvement that listeners notice in free speech. And there's a couple of studies here, and you'll see the references at the end, that looked at, compared people who were taught with kind of segmentally focused instruction, the kind that many of us have done, and people who are taught mostly with suprasegmentally or global instruction. And what we find is that when they speak in controlled contexts, like things like the reading, that they both types of instruction lead to improvement. But if they're speaking freely, if they're speaking in spontaneous speech, only the suprasegmental instruction is the thing that people notice, and that listeners say, oh, they're better in this one than they were in the other. So when we're talking about English suprasegmentals, what's included? Well, word stress. This is a word-based suprasegmental, and you can see a pair of words that are differing in stress here between bellow and below. Okay, the first syllable stressed on bellow, the second syllable stressed on below. And this is an element of suprasegmentals, or prosody, word prosody. You also see it in words that are related but are different parts of speech. So in English, we have a lot of these words like calorie, calorie, first syllable stressed. But if we turn it into an adjective, we end up with caloric, caloric. And this change in the suprasegmentals of which syllable is stressed changes the vowels of the A and the O letters. Okay, so you end up with ka versus ka, and la versus lor. Okay, so word stress is part of what we're talking about. Rhythm. In English, when you see a sentence like this, we have 9 words, as you can notice there. The books on the shelf fell on the floor. But in English, we have a kind of rhythm that gives you a beat on only some of those words. So we hear, the books on the shelf fell on the floor. The books on the shelf fell on the floor. And those words like the and on that you see there all get reduced and don't have much of a pronunciation at all. So this tells you a lot about how English connected speech works. We also have intonation. Intonation shows up in several ways in English. Intonation has to do with the use of voice pitch to communicate meaning. It shows up in thought groups. So we have this sentence that has actually two different readings, and you can probably see them. And they have different grammatical elements, but they have a lot to do with intonation. So John said his sister is a very good golfer versus John said his sister is a very good golfer. And what you can notice is that we have a difference in where it sounds like I'm pausing. But in reality, I'm not really pausing. I'm using my voice pitch. John said his sister is a very good golfer. John said his sister is a very good golfer. So you have this versus and you have the pitch of the voice signaling a difference in the grouping of the words. Intonation is also part of what we call prominence. And so what you end up with here is like a sentence like this. It sounded confusing, really confusing. And if you listen to where the voice pitch changes, you notice that on the first confusing, the voice pitch goes up and then drops, right? And then the second time, our pitch moves over to really, and confusing stays pretty flat and low in pitch. Okay, so that's another part of intonation in English, part of our suprasegmentals. And then what I call final intonation. Okay, what we have here in this little made-up dialogue are 4 questions. And some people think that these types of questions always are going to have a rising pitch because that's what questions do. But if you listen to them and you listen to where the pitch ends up, whether it ends up high or ends up low, you end up with, you're really going? And that one goes high. And what happens on this next one? Why are you surprised? And that one drops. Get the same question back again. Why am I surprised? Okay, and that one rises, and then a single word sentence. Seriously? Okay, again, a way for pitch to communicate meaning. And if you look at those, why are you surprised, falling, versus why am I surprised, rising, you'll notice also that the second one has an extra meaning of kind of surprise or shock as to what the other person had said. So we have our different suprasegmentals. We have the different parts of intonation, and we have rhythm, and we have word stress. But why are these hard to teach? because they are hard to teach for most people. In fact, a lot of teachers just kind of skip them because it's much easier to talk about vowels and consonants. They're hard to teach because the ways that we use pitch, length, and loudness are very deep within our unconscious L1 competence. Okay. We speak in a way that we do with the suprasegmentals we do because it is what feels right in the language. Because of our L1 suprasegmentals, we also find it harder to attend to the way that the L2 creates meaning out of those same things. Different languages use pitch, length, and loudness differently. And we kind of don't transfer those very easily. So this is why suprasegmentals really affect accentedness. And then last, from a teacher's point of view, there's really no consistent way to represent suprasegmentals. And not all ways of representing them are equally good for L2 learners. And you'll see this in some of the comics that are coming up. But suprasegmentals or prosody can be marked by underlining, by capitals, by italics, by bolding, by all kinds of different ways. But ultimately, they're all talking about pitch, length, and loudness differences. So what I'd like to do is give you some examples of 4 different ways to teach suprasegmentals. So the first one has to do with explaining. The second one with raising awareness. The third with improving perception, or how we hear things. And the fourth with improving production. Any one of these, I could probably give you 45 minutes all by itself, but we're going to try to do them all in a quicker way. So, explanation. This is one of my favorite old Luann comics. And if you can see it, it says, Surviving the Teen Years, a Guide for Parents. When children become teens, they turn rebellious and tend to challenge parental authority. And you have the toddler, mother and toddler, and mother and teen. And in both cases, the mother says the same thing, because I said so. And the toddler says, oh, Okay, so from that one, we go to the teen, because I said so. And the teen says, oh. And if we were together in the same room, I would ask you to tell me what's going on. And in the first one, in the second one, we have everything the same, except that the toddler has a kind of quiet falling intonation. And the falling intonation says, okay. And in the second one, the teen has a not so quiet rising intonation, which is saying, I'm questioning your right to say that. So this is a one way to explain the differences between falling and rising intonation. And the students that I've always get it really, really quickly. And it's not, I don't have to tell them about, intonation and all of the different patterns of intonation. We have a really clear distinction here. Here's another one. So this says the importance of punctuation. But if you want here, go ahead and type in the chat box what you think the pronunciation issue is here. What is the pronunciation issue? Remember, we're talking about suprasegmentals, and see if you can come up with an explanation. And then I will give you mine as well. So for me, this is also another intonation element. It's the thought groups type of thing. So stop ahead is said in one phrase, whereas this one is stop ahead. It has a intonational break between stop and and of course you see the bizarro writer Dan Ferraro plays with this to show the difference between what you might see around the corner. So I'm going to take you out a little bit now for what these kinds of what visualizations can do for you. This comes from a study, and I forgot to put it on the reference list, I just realized, by Oliver Niebuhr and his group who work in Denmark. And this is German, if you didn't know that. And what they did is they tested different ways of representing German intonation for Danish speakers. And what you see is 6 different ways that they tested in with these Danish learners of German. The first one is kind of the angular moving line. Okay, so you end up with, starting at a particular level, jumping up, driving down, and then dropping, and then going back to that beginning level before you drop down and go up again. The second one is quite similar, except that it's kind of free form. It doesn't give you a sense that there's a particular syllable that the jumps and the drops go up and down. The third one is the British Tadpole visualization. And what you have here is the dark circles are the syllables, and the very dark, very large circles are the prominent syllables, and the ups and downs are shown by the tadpole tails. So in this one you can see that that first part, ga, is the prominent syllable. 4, the D, number D, is the moving typeface visualization. And this was done by Dwight Bollinger, a linguist from the 1950s through the 1990s, who was at Berkeley, I think, or Stanford, one of the two. And you can see that instead of having lines or tadpoles, you just move the type. So that's the 4th one. 5th one is a little bit more abstract, and what you have is little apostrophes that suggest that you're going up in pitch, or arrows that say you're going directly down in pitch or up in pitch, lengthened syllables, those colons like in Vic at the end there tell you that the syllable is longer. So this is doing the same kind of thing, prosody, especially intonation, but using things that you can type on the same line. You don't have to put things above or below or move your typeface. And then the last one is theoretical linguistics, laboratory phonology approach. And the L means low, the H means high, and the other things like the percentage sign tell you you're at the beginning of a sentence. The star means that you're accenting the syllable. But this is the last one that they tested. If you had to guess, which ones would you think were the easiest for students to learn intonation from and which ones were the hardest, I suspect that you would come up with the answers that they did. E and F were the hardest. Students just struggled with them. They were too abstract. They had to know too much. They had to put together the speaking of the sentence along with this formalism that was hard to deal with. But the first two were the best, those lines. And actually the angular lines for their study was better than the A group, was better than B. So what does this tell us about explaining intonation? It tells us that these kinds of more iconic visualizations help learners much more than things that are probably more accurate, like F, but are not easy to process. All of these explanations that I showed you, the comics and the visualizations, don't do a lot of explaining that makes L2 learners understand the phonetic and acoustic elements of the description. And this is deliberate. And I'm going to give you a quote here from Judy Gilbert. She says, when teaching pronunciation, simplicity is best because if a lesson is too complicated, students get discouraged. And a discouraged student is harder to teach. For instance, when explaining the difference between the final sounds of had and have, it's going the hard way to use the terms plosive and fricative. It's much easier to explain with everyday terms like stop sound and continuing sound, because the basic words are more apt to be familiar and in fact have been used by linguists at least as far back as 1967. So we don't have to make our students into linguists in order to teach them. And in fact, it's probably better that we don't. So an awareness, that was all explanation. So what can we do with this kind of thing with raising awareness? And this is from Judy Gilbert's book, Clear Speech, which many of you probably know. And she has these types of continuous lines, right? So how do you spell ease? And on that one, what we see is that the pitch goes up on ease and then ends up dropping. How do you spell ease? And then the person spells it, E-A-S-E. And we end up with the same pattern showing up here. How do you spell easy? Same pattern, E-A-S-Y. So this kind of visualization allows the student to know what the music of those sentences is and what they should sound like, where the pitch should go up, where it should go down. and where it should basically stay flat. Another way to visualize has to do, and raise awareness, has to do with rhythm. And this is something that comes from actually a 1985 book by Clifford Prater and Betty Wallace Robinette, looking at the difference between what they called a stress-timed language and a syllable-timed language. The stress-timed is the bottom, the syllable-timed is the top. And the visualization says to you that in a syllable-timed language, all of the syllables are pretty similar in their length and timing. In a stress-timed language, the bottom picture, the different syllables, in this case, the different people, have different heights, have different pitch heights, or different lengths. They're shorter, longer, they have shorter legs versus longer legs. And this is a way that is often quite helpful for learners to hear what's going on in a language like English when they're not used to hearing it. If they come from a language where like French, where the syllables are more similar to each other. If you remember that sentence, the books on the shelf fell on the floor. What you have is books and shelf and fell and floor are the tall people, and the other one, the thes and the ons, are the short people in that one. Another type of awareness raising. This is an exercise from some materials that we are working on right now. And this is from a thought group. One of the things that happens in languages, we use numbers a lot and we talk about them a lot, but they're not always easy to hear if we don't group them alike. And we could go through all of these, but what I'd like you to think about is those four on the left. The one with the $sign, the one with the word bottles, the one with the percent, and the one with the address after it. How do you say the 1306 in each of those? So in the $sign, you'd probably say 1306. You might be more exact and say $13.06. But it's a 13 and an 06. But for the bottles, what would you say for the same four numbers? I would say 1306. Some people might say 1306. The next one, you would say 13.06%, whereas you ignore the point element of the top one. You don't say $13.06. That would be silly. Okay. And then the last one, 1306 Curtis Road. You can't do the 1306 Curtis Road element here like you could do if you wanted with bottles. So all of these numbers have ways to read them. And those ways have to do a lot with the variety of English that you're speaking. So I would say for the middle one, room 356, whereas British English colleagues almost always say room 356. And when students have to use numbers, if they're doing a credit card on the phone or they're having to give an address, if they don't group them the way that the listener is expecting to hear them, they will be misunderstood, even if they say all the numbers correctly. Perception. This has to do with how you're listening. This is another comic. I feel like Donna Brinton with comics, but they're really marvelous to show some of these things. So this is the Beetle Bailey comic and the Sarge and Beetle Bailey, and he says, "Why do they call this Lookout Point?" And as he steps off the edge of it, Beetle Bailey says, "I can't hear you, I know, but you should say, look out." Okay, the first one is look out, right? The second one is look out. Oh, it's a warning. Okay, so what we have is a word stress difference that is based on hearing where the stress pattern moves. The first one has stress on the first syllable, the second one has it on the second syllable. And you don't even see that in how they show the type here. But if you know English, you know that they will be pronounced differently. Another way to do perception, again with stress patterns, is use something that many of us would probably use anyway, a bingo card. And what you can see on this bingo card is that you have a lot of minimal pairs, minimal stress pairs. Okay, so if you start at the top left, descent, and then you look down toward the bottom right, you have its pair, decent. Okay, and you can do these in many different ways, but what you're really training here is perception, whether they're hearing the stress on one syllable versus another. Okay, and students like this kind of thing. It's a lot more fun than having me explain how word stress works in English. This is like the British say bringing coals to Newcastle. In Iowa, we might say bringing corn to Iowa. If I talk about kazoos with Katisol people, Judy Gilbert has probably already told you about these 4 dozen times. But kazoos are a really good way to visualize or auditize intonation. So when students look at something like this and they see you're really going, why are you surprised? Why am I surprised? Seriously? They tend to focus on the grammar of the sentence, and they don't know what that sentence actually sounds like. And a kazoo allows you to get rid of the words and the sounds and keep the prosody. So if you're doing it with you're really going, you end up with okay. If you've never used a kazoo before, don't ever try to do it seriously the first time you give these to your students, because they spend all the day laughing. And then you get and you can hear that pitch movement of on surprised, where it goes up on pry and then drops to the end. Okay. You hear the pitch rise at the end there, suggesting that you're unbelieving. And one of the things, you can do it with a kazoo, you can do it with humming. Kazoos are more fun, but they allow learners to hear the suprasegmentals that they don't see in the dialogues. You can also, another Judy Gilbert item here with physical movement. another helpful way to teach suprasegmentals is to embody them. Okay, so in this case, if you look, you have banana, banana. And what you do is you pull the rubber band out on the stressed syllable, and then you let it go back quickly on the unstressed. So banana. And in the time it takes you to pull the rubber band, you're doing what English stressed syllables do. That is, they become longer. And that embodied element of taking time to pull a rubber band allows you to also take time and stretch the syllable out. And you can do this kind of physical movement in other ways. I think, Marcia, I associate this with you, has like a stress stretch. So you stand up from your seat when you're doing it. So banana, you can do that. You can do it with your hands, just banana, okay? All of these things have in common that you're using your physical movement to connect to what we do with our speech movements. This is another one from our materials showing the same thing with a bunch of words. They're all two-syllable words, and some of them have stress on the first syllable and some on the second syllable. And you can see that we've done that by marking them with caps and bolding. Okay. Another type of exercise that works for suprasegmentals very well, especially for rhythm, has to do with, I'm going to give you this sentence: the rhythm of long sentences is built from the end, not the beginning. Okay, so what we have here are 7 things. Now, I won't be able to hear you, but I'm going to have you do this with me. We'll try to do each one 2 times and just repeat after me. The beginning. The beginning. Not the beginning. Not the beginning. The end, not the beginning. The end, not the beginning. Built from the end, not the beginning. Built from the end, not the beginning. Is built from the end, not the beginning. Is built from the end, not the beginning. Long sentences is built from the end, not the beginning. Long sentences is built from the end, not the beginning. And then finally, the rhythm of long sentences is built from the end, not the beginning. The rhythm of long sentences is built from the end, not the beginning. The idea behind this exercise is that rhythm in a new language is almost always easier to feel and to succeed at when you start from the end of the sentence. In most of our reading aloud practice or presentation practice, we tend to start from the beginnings of sentences. And if you have longer sentences like this one, usually about midway through it, you start to stumble in the language. And you probably have seen this with your students, that they start to put ums in and stall and mix words up. But if you start from the end and you're working on rhythm, you end up getting a very good kind of feel for the rhythm. And students are pretty successful at hearing what it is that's being modeled. So I like build-up exercises a lot. And then you have something that is kind of goes beyond these more controlled things. And this looks at what Jen Foote and Kim McDonough did in a study on shadowing. And Janet Goodwin was the first one that I knew of who did this kind of thing, but others have done it as well. So what you do is you take a sitcom scene and students shadow it. In this one, this is one from Foote and McDonough. You'll probably see this. Some of you may know it anyway.
Will you all excuse me? Leonard is subtly signaling that he'd like to talk to me in private.
No.
So listen to how they speak and think about how you would shadow them.
Yeah, I remember specifically. I mean, you started by asking if I was from Mars because my ass was out of this world.
Well, that does sound like me, but no.
Is there some problem?
Yeah, listen, I have to kind of sneak out for a while.
All right, goodbye.
No, wait. If anyone asks you where I went, you don't know.
Where are you going?
I can't tell you that.
Who would ask me?
I can't tell you that either.
So you brought me in here to inform me that you can't tell me where you're going, and you can't tell me who might ask?
Yeah, I really didn't think this through.
Leonard, a moment.
What?
If someone, and of course we don't know who this would be, does ask where you've gone, what should I say?
I don't know. Just tell them I went to the office.
Are you going to the office?
No.
Well, then how can I say it convincingly?
Just say Leonard went to the office.
All right. Leonard went to the office.
No, not like that. Just Leonard went to the office.
This would have worked out a lot better if you just told me you were going to the office.
I'm going to the office.
See, why don't I believe you?
I'm going out for a while. Okay.
Doesn't anyone want to know where he's going?
Okay, where is he going?
Leonard is going to the office.
Okay, sorry, I think that some of this was not shared according to what I'm seeing here. So let's go back and go to sharing of this again. That's from, obviously, from Big Bang Theory. And one of the things that this kind of activity does is it kind of brings everything together. You end up with intonational elements, you end up with rhythmic elements, you end up with this kind of lengthened sharing, you end up with having body language, and all of these things come together to give you a global way to teach suprasegmentals. Okay, so let me conclude. Suprasegmentals are global features of spoken language. They're always there. They're what makes spoken language spoken language. And they are worth teaching for every level of learner. For lower level learners, you may need to do more careful repetition. For upper level learners, you can let them work on making the language their own. If suprasegmentals are emphasized in the classroom teaching, students make improvements that others can hear. This is really important to know. We want to teach pronunciation so that students actually sound better, not just pronounce better. Suprasegmentals, from my view, are best taught indirectly, and that is without long-winded explanations, by visualizing or embodying the key features of the suprasegmentals. And you can do this with acoustic things like Pratt, or you can do it with comics, or you can do it with just drawing on the board.
May I interrupt for one little second?
Mm-hmm.
John,
Yes.
do you mean to share any PowerPoint with you at this moment? Do you wish to be sharing
Are you not seeing the PowerPoint?
Correct.
Oh, really? Seriously?
Well, no, just from, yes, I'm serious. I'm very serious. According to people who are already commenting, it's right after the piece that you shared with us from Big Bang Theory. So
Okay,
if you'd like to show us from there, then that would be awesome. Yes, excellent. You did it.
Okay, sorry.
No worries.
Just shows you that Zoom can get anybody.
No worries. You're doing great.
And then perception of form and meaning of suprasegmentals are especially important for these, because as is the practice that goes beyond the word and sentence level. A lot of what we do stays at the sentence or the word level, but suprasegmentals really come into their own. They really make a difference when we start putting sentences together, not just saying them all by themselves. So let me go ahead, and there's the references there, and I'll try to add the one reference I'm missing before I give this to Marcia. And let me then say questions or questions. In one I sound.
All right, questions or questions? Yes, I think it would be wonderful. Thank you so much, John, for condensing into such a short period of time why we should be understanding suprasegmentals, also known as prosody, to understand why we need to teach it and give us some very good advice about how to go about doing that. So we have a number of questions from the audience, and some people, if they're shy, they may simply type and I will read their question. If they're not shy, may I invite you to unmic and share with us what your question is. Can I just call on you, Patrick? Because I know you have a question. And we could see you maybe if you'd like to show your face.
Oh, of course. Thank you, Marcia. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. I'm very much interested in suprasegmentals and prosody and teaching these features of pronunciation. Have been doing it for years. I'm a non-native language teacher myself, so I've used a lot of these techniques on my own pronunciation. But the question I have is, in your professional opinion, how do we best help students to internalize prosody rules to improve spontaneous speech? Because a common feedback I get from my students is that they understand the principles in the classroom and they can read things really well and apply these principles, but then they find it hard to really apply them in the speech they construct outside of the classroom.
It's a really good question. For years, I've written things about this, and I think that there are particular types of suprasegmental features that, when connected with particular functions, work without having to understand a system. Okay, so let me give you an example. If you're doing what some people would call contrastive stress, okay, so the the cat's on the table, not under it. Okay, so that on and under, these things can be taught without having to teach them about all the rules of how prominence can do things like shape English speech or change the information structure. So you have things like that where you can teach particular elements of suprasegmentals without having to do the system. And I think that that's really helpful to know, because I spent a lot of years trying to teach the system, and my students would always get confused and say, well, oh, wasn't that new information? Because maybe they like the idea of new information. But it didn't work for them to apply it, just like you're talking about. So I've moved back from that to give these kind of high value suprasegmental features first, things that can fit into, and that do fit into, contrastive stress, for example. Learners can get it without ever being taught about contrastive stress, or without ever being taught about prominence. And it goes from, once they understand it, to their speech. I had, in a study that we did that was in TESL Journal in 2018, I remember having students who were from Dubai, or Oman, and we were doing this, and I remember at one point the two of the girls who were there in the class said, they both went at the same time, oh, and they never made another mistake. So they somehow internalized something that they perhaps had noticed but didn't know what to do with it. But they could do that without me teaching them anything about other uses of prominence. So there's a chapter or a journal article that I wrote with Linda Grant back in 2003, where we talked about this really important issue. I think it's hard to teach the whole system. I think students do get confused, rightly. I think teachers get confused. I don't know if that helps answer your question, but if you want that article, you can email me and I can get it to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your answer. I will email you, and
Okay.
and yeah, thank you so much.
Okay.
Well, let's not be shy, pronunciation teachers.
Because Marcia surely isn't.
Well, let's give it a try. Come on, let's share the airwaves. And I'm sure that you have some thoughts and perhaps questions that we can ask our presenter today. So who would like to ask the next question? Oh, Megan.
I would like to ask one then, if no one is going.
Oh, yes, please. And you are?
Radek from Prague.
Yes.
Thanks very much, John. This was very interesting. I have a question. I don't know if you probably know Ulle Kjellin, right? From Sweden. Yeah. He has this idea that prosody is actually the easiest thing to learn or to teach. because, and basically he gives a very similar argument. You're saying that it's hard to teach because the ways we use pitch, loudness, and length are very deep without our unconscious L1 competence. And he says, well, it's very easy because it's exactly these things that we use just in a slightly different way. What would you say to that?
I've wanted Ole to give me some kind of evidence besides saying my students do well for years, and I'd love it if, because he uses the choral repetition with long stretches of repetition, and he says that he gets really good, remarkable results with Swedish as a second language learners. I would love to see it tested in more than just saying that he's gotten really good results. And mostly because it might be that Ole is just fabulous, and I'm not. But I'd like to see that. But my suspicion is that when we're speaking in a second or third language, there are certain things that go into automatic pilot. So we're thinking about, what are the words I need to use? What is the grammar? Oh, did I forget that stupid ending again? And things like the prosody kind of are not automatic. We go back to what is automatic, which is our dominant language. And so I don't know to what extent Ole's method of doing this would transfer to spontaneous speech when you're trying to think about a lot of other things. I'd love it if it does, but I've not seen the evidence for it.
I feel the same way. Thank you.
Doesn't he talk about having hundreds of repetitions of sample sentences, and then going to find your own model and using that model and repeating over many times? And there are people who have touted this method of being able to approximate the prosody of the target language, whether it's English or Chinese or some other.
There was a study that is relevant to this, and it's Deborah Hardison did a study on French intonation back in, I think, 2004. And what the students did is they were given 30 different sentences, some of which were just kind of normal French sentences, and some of which were kind of these exclamatory or idiomatic uses of intonation. And they practiced with them over and over and over and over, to the point that they knew all those sentences and they knew them cold. And when they heard the intonation without the words, they could identify what sentence they were hearing. But one of the things that helped them in this is that they started to pay attention to other elements of their French pronunciation, because those particular sentences became so automatic that they started to pay attention to whether their consonants were linking to the next vowel, and other elements of French, even though they weren't supposed to be working on it. So it might help to have this kind of practice, but I don't know to what extent it transfers strongly into speech that you have to make up yourself.
Would it have anything to do with, John and the rest of you, with like learning the lyrics of a song and hearing the melody over and over and playing it in your, I mean, some of you came early, and you heard me sing a few tunes because they were like earworms, and they were, you know, songs that people young and old in our household have been singing. So it sort of reminds me of how that type of repetition where you're doing it as a song, because, and you know, you do it over and over, and you develop that sense of phrasing and rhythm and intonation without thinking of it as being pronunciation per se.
Right. Yeah, it may be, but we do know that you know, people can sing pretty well in another dialect or another language, and it doesn't transfer over to their speech.
Oh,
I've heard there's a Norwegian group that does bluegrass music in the US, the Haiti Bluegrass Orchestra or something. And, you know, they sound like they're from Arkansas, but not when they speak.
Oh, okay. Well, Ben has a question, so let's let Ben go ahead, take the floor.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for this very informative workshop. Thank you. I really would like to know, how would you provide meaningful feedback, something that will help students improve? And the other part of my question is, how about rubrics? Like, which kind of language do you use to create, you know, student-friendly rubrics, something that our students can, you know, understand? Because we all know that it's really unrealistic to use all this terminology when creating these rubrics. Thank you so much for your answer.
Okay, so how would I give feedback? It's a good question. And I think probably I would use feedback by, depending on what I'm teaching, right? So you gave me feedback, but suprasegmentals in general. So if I'm doing something with word stress, I would do one thing, because that still is tied within the word level, and you know, you can find things about stress in dictionaries, so students seem more sensitive to it. If we're dealing with something like rhythm or intonation, I would probably do something that would visualize. So with intonation, you can use programs like Pratt, the free acoustics program, to show a student's production against a model production. So they can see where things are moving up and down. In terms of rubrics, I don't know. I don't use them. Maybe
That's okay. Yes, if you don't use them, you don't use them. I'm just curious to know. But thank you so much. This is really...
one of my colleagues here, Sinem Sonsat Hegelheimer, has built into a lot of her class things for self-evaluation of speech. Okay, so in that sense, it's a rubric like element, but I don't use them personally. Okay. But that's my failing, not anyone else's.
Well, you know, I think this is exciting because we now have gathering ideas for future talks. Obviously, in our Teaching of Pronunciation interest group series, we have speakers on different topics throughout the month. We meet on the third Friday of every month at this time. And we have a couple that I will be announcing pretty soon, but I don't want to stop the conversation. I believe somebody else. Allison, did you want to bring up your question about automaticity?
Well, actually, if you don't mind, Marcia, I could answer the question about rubrics, or at least say
Oh,
what.
good.
Oh yeah, do it.
So I've used rubrics on the Canvas, the learning management system. And so the 3 categories, and this of course is after it's explained. And I should preface this with, I work with advanced level learners. So the 3 characteristics, well, usually 2 characteristics, at least pitch change, as John mentioned, and the duration and length. So if they have a list of words and they're reading the list of words, I would give them feedback on the placement and the production of the pitch and the length of the syllables.
Thank you, Allison.
Sure. I think the
Well, that's
question that I had
good.
about
Do you want to go
automaticity,
to
Marcia, oh, sorry, the question that I had about automaticity is, I think pronunciation is challenging in general. And so I'm curious, as us as a community and a group, to think about just any feature that we teach in pronunciation. And John, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Anything that we teach in pronunciation, we want it to be automatic, or to just not have to think about it, right, out of the conscious mind. And so I think that whether it's a individual vowel sound or consonant, that it's also the same with suprasegmental features, and that we have to scaffold the approach. But that's something I'm still also grappling with in my practice.
I think that's true. And with segmentals, it's often easier because students kind of know about them, even if they don't really know. With suprasegmentals, they hide. And sometimes some people are really good mimics. They kind of converge toward the people that they're speaking with, and pick up a lot of these things almost unconsciously. But a lot of us are not, and we target the wrong things, and so it does help to have somebody tell you what's going on in whatever way they can that communicates to you, and then to figure out ways to practice to get this kind of automaticity, because mostly our suprasegmentals from our dominant language are pretty automatic. They're the last thing that we want to think about. We just want to communicate, and part of the way we communicate in speech is through these suprasegmentals, but we don't often hear the small differences. There was another study from many years ago from Brazilian Portuguese and American English, where the intonation contours, there were places where the two languages had the same contour, same meaning, others where they had the same contours but with different meanings, and then others where they just had different contours. And that same contour but different meaning was really hard for learners, going both ways, because they would produce it, but they wouldn't get the reaction that they expected.
I think, sometimes as we are practitioners and we're teachers and we're thinking about rubrics, I have a rubric and I use sometimes the rubric. I'm not sure that the students actually grasp that. I was looking at different categories, and whether they understood it or not, they just knew whether something sounded right or didn't, right? Because people have different ways of interpreting information. It's just like whether you explain things simply enough for them to get it, or you explain it so discreetly that it's way above their head and they can't access it. In my book, phrase by phrase, I have these activities where I have students pair up, and it's an info gap type of a thing, but they're supposed to give feedback to their partner only on one or two things. right? Because they can't possibly have the wealth of information that we as pronunciation practitioners have, or as English language, native or near native speakers have. So I give them just something really simple, whether they pronounce the s or the z or the is correctly on a word, for example, or when they're doing a conversation and whether they did the rising intonation in the certain place or not. So it gives them a chance to focus just on one or two or maybe three aspects of pronunciation, so that it heightens their awareness that there is such a thing as suprasegmental, and that they can listen for that one thing, because there's so many other things, there are so many other factors, right? You just give them a few, and then they can begin to understand that the way they say something has an effect, and they can start listening for that. So hopefully it attunes them to not only their partner, but just sort of in general to picking things up. Because this is hard stuff we're talking about, right?
Marcia, it said somewhere on here that several people raised their hand, but I don't see who they are.
Sorry, I'm not even seeing, I don't know where I am. I'm busy looking at the beautiful gallery of people here, and I have lost the
Seth
visual.
and Bon have their hands up.
So thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm done with my question. My apologies. I'm gonna try. My apologies. I'm done.
Maybe
Okay.
just
Okay,
Seth
how about
then.
let's listen to Seth.
Okay, so thank you. So regarding the contrastive stress pattern, I'm wondering if what might make it challenging nowadays for some students to produce that or to master it is that it seems to be disappearing from the speech of some native speakers. And I've heard this on the radio and television, maybe in person as well, where somebody, rather than saying, for example, product A costs $1,000, but product B costs $5,000. I hear them emphasizing dollars, native speakers, product A costs $1,000, product B costs $5,000. And I'm thinking, there may be no direct answer to that, but I'm thinking that as that disappears from the speech of native speakers, it may be hard for, it's harder for learners to pick that up.
Yeah,
I want to say something about that, because I think that they're bad script readers. Because if they're doing an advertisement, then they're reading off of a script, and their director has not directed them properly. I mean, let me tell you, as a book writer and a person who writes things that have to be recorded, when I was doing my book, which book? Oral communication, and like I had so many dialogues and so many things and so many recordings. I listened to every single one, and I sent back a whole bunch of them because I did not want them to read that way. I said, this must be read with this stress and intonation pattern. Do it again.
Yeah.
And so when I hear the things that you just made an example of, Seth, I think they didn't read correctly.
Right, and if they are going off of the script, they aren't always very good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So and what you were talking about, Seth, sounded like people on some kind of media, either television or radio,
Well, I've heard it in spontaneous speech too, when people are just being interviewed, and it's they're just producing that as they don't seem to have an automatic sense of why certain things, an unconscious sense of why certain things get stressed and others don't. I don't know. There's no answer, but I think that can make it challenging for our learners too. And certainly what Marcia said is very helpful, of course.
Yeah.
Looks like Patrick, you'd like to add something?
I have one more question, just a quick one.
Okay, you've moved from the bottom of my screen to the top, so.
Thank you. So John, you've shown us a few different ways of representing prosody with visual cues, but I'm wondering what does research tell us about using colors? For example, I've used different colors to mark content words and distinguish them from function words, and then also different ones to signal prominence, or these focal words in a sentence. So do we have any research that tells us anything about the effectiveness of marking suprasegmentals with different colors? And if so, what color schemes would work best?
Probably not red, green. I haven't seen any with color. There was a study just recently that was looking at, I took it out of the presentation today, but it's in the article, looking at the marking of length in Swedish. So for Swedish as second language learners. And there are two schemes that are used for basically, I think originally helping children, L1 children, to learn to read in Swedish. And so vowels can be lengthened and consonants can be lengthened in Swedish. And there's different ways to do this. You can make sure that you mark them both as lengthened, or you can mark just the vowels, and if the vowel's not marked, the consonant is supposed to be lengthened. And the study by Bosse Toren and his Hyesong Jong, I think, found that the one that explicitly marked both types of length was a lot better for the learners than the one that only marked one and assumed that the other would follow. So maybe it would work. I don't know. These are the kinds of things, these types of techniques that we just don't have very much research on, and I hope we get it. We're starting to see some of it come in, but we don't have enough yet. You know, teachers come up with really interesting ways to do things, but they appear to be successful and the teachers are happy with them, but we don't know why they work, if they work. For, you know, if you stick them in a new teacher's hand, would they be able to reproduce it? But it's an interesting idea.
Thank you so much.
Great. Well, we have taken a lot of our speakers' time, and I'm so appreciative of your expertise, John. It's been really great. So I think what we should do is give a round of applause to our speaker, and maybe you can see that visually. A few words that I would
Marcia,
like to...
I will send you the
right. You will send me
slide.
stuff that I can share with everybody.
Yes.
After the program is over.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. Thank you. I'd like to let you know, in case you haven't already heard, that AM English is being offered free to students and teachers, or teachers and therefore to their students. There are 45 different online programs which may be of use to you, especially if you're doing things remotely, whether you're doing things remotely or not. And if you are interested, that you can find more information by emailing info@Sunburst Media. I'd like to also let you know that we're going to listen to Marla Yoshida at our next top event, and she's going to be talking about the activities, pronunciation practice activities for remote classrooms. And Patrick, whom we heard from today too, will also do a presentation, and that will be in June. So mark your calendars for every third Friday at 11 a.m. California time, whether we're in daylight savings as we are now, or when we go back to standard. That's our time frame for top events. So we're looking forward to those exciting events. And some of you who are in our audience now, I'd like to invite you to consider joining us as a presenter if you'd like to share something. One more reminder that if you're not yet a TESL member, there are really great reasons to join our group. We do have, TESL is giving a conference coming up May 7th and 8th. We're calling this Riding the Tide, which stands for Transformation, Inclusion, Diversity. What is the last one? Equity? Oh, there we go. Yeah, engagement. So that's coming up May 7th and 8th. And if you go to TESL.org, that gives you information on how you can sign up for it. We are very grateful to TESL for hosting this wonderful event. And here is a place for you to download a chapter. So let me put that into the chat right now. And if you are eager to download the chapter of John's that he wrote with Dorothy Chun from, is she UC Santa Barbara? Is that right? Let's see if I can find, yeah, okay. And how do I, let's see, I just go here, I'm gonna copy this, and I'm going to put this into the chat for all to access and download. Okay, so that is prosody in second language teaching methodologies and effectiveness. All right, once again, I'd like to give a round of applause to our presenter, John Levis. Thank you so much. See you all next month.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Marsha.
Bye.
Yeah, I can email stuff out to people who are not going to try to access it from their mobile device or something like that. No worries.